Good afternoon, everyone. We are here for
They're
the
saying you're supposed to be on this call.
Family and Juvenile Law
Okay.
Subcommittee. I'm Delegate Charlotte Crutchfield. I'm the chair of the subcommittee, and we are going to get started. Our only bill is SB 400, which also has a cross file of HB 497. So if everybody will mute themselves, and we'll take turns, of course, speaking, and I'll identify the speakers. I wanted to just roughly go over the bill. We had a hearing on HB 497. And if you recall, this is a bill to deal with the transportation companies and regulating those which are involved with transporting youth to various, I guess, camps and other organizations where they are transported to, and to just provide guidelines for all of that. So I'm Delegate Stewart or either Spencer. I'm just going to let you. Okay, go ahead. I'll let you briefly explain if I have not explained the details of your bill. I'm good.
You crushed it, Elliot Crutchfield. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So SB 400 came over with some amendments. And Spencer, if you can kind of tell us a little bit about those amendments to the bill, that'd be great.
Yes, ma'am. As members may know, this was a cross-file request from Delegate Stewart. And from the House hearing, there were a few elements that were going to strengthen the bill and make it even more stringent that the Senate did adopt. There was a question as to whether or not DHS facilities should be subject to it, and what parts of the bill they should or should not be subject to. And I believe there was an intent to restrict just the time requirement or the time restriction in the bill from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. And I believe with the language that the Senate Finance Committee adopted, it was broader than that. So the amendments that were sent to the committee, or I think that are being worked on in the background with Delegate Stewart's team, fixes that and adds a few additional pieces that we weren't aware of, but that Senator Guile does support.
Okay. Got it. All right. So I know Senator Giles' bill, I think the amendments, again, like you mentioned, were regarding the time when the transport can actually happen. And that's from, and I'm looking at actually her version of the bill with the amendments in it. And that's on page 4. And I'm looking at line 24 through 26, which talks about the hours between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Are not going to be a child cannot be picked up during those time periods. So I think that's the one you're referring to.
You said page 4.
But I'm looking at,
Yes.
yes, a reiterated version of it, which includes the amendments. And so that's where it talks about it. But anyway, I think that's part of it. And what I had hoped to accomplish was to have Delegate Stewart's requested amendments overlaid on top of Delegate Giles, and I don't have that, but I do have your amendments, Delegate Stewart. So do you want to talk about those a little bit? Because I think the first one dealt with clarity.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'm happy to. Thank you.
Okay.
And I do have a reprint version of the House bill that I think incorporates all the amendments. It's not overly complicated. I can briefly walk through what we're thinking
Okay,
here.
if you have that, could you send that to me?
Yeah, I will.
Okay,
I think I
because
have a
yeah,
final reprint version of the House bill, and I'm going to email that to you right now.
okay, okay, got it.
I'm gonna email. One great thing about being district mates is I have like 80 of your emails, and I'm just going to use all of them. Okay. So there are basically just four changes
Mhm.
that are worth mentioning. First, there's just a clarification amendment of the applicability of the bill. And basically, it specifies that the prohibitions we're talking about on these youth transportation companies include any time they're transporting children where the final intended destination is a residential childcare program. That final intended destination is just clarity because we didn't want to basically create this giant loophole where these companies wouldn't be subjected to the bill if they said, "Oh, we're not transporting a kid to one of these camps. We're just going to the airport." and then from the airport, then they go to the camp. So that's the clarifying amendment there, is we want to just make it clear that even if there are stops on the way, even if there are stops that are not in Maryland, if the final intended destination is one of these types of camps or wilderness retreats or whatever, then the bill applies. So that's kind of a technical amendment. The second bucket of amendments actually really comes from this committee, and they were intended to be responsive to some of the questions that the committee asked around, especially damages. So we essentially added 4 things based on some of the comments we got from y'all. First, we added a new damage type, compensatory damages. Previously, there were only reasonable attorney's fees and restitution damages available. So this would be compensatory damages, which is pretty standard. Secondly, we clarify that the bill is not retroactive, and then it's only prospective. Third, we establish a 10-year statute of limitation for bringing one of these actions against a youth transportation company. But if the committee wanted to go higher or lower on that, that's not like a sticking point for me, but we threw out a 10-year statute of limitation period. And then fourth, we prevented a contract between a transportation company and a parent or guardian of the child. We prevented one of those contracts from including a provision purporting to waive the child's right to bring a lawsuit. This is a kind of thing that unfortunately happens, where basically the transportation company will contract with the parent to provide this service. They'll traumatize the child, and then when the child goes and tries to sue later for this said trauma, they'll find out that their parents actually waived their right to do so in the contract. And it's questionable whether or not this is constitutional. Courts across the country have gone different ways on this, but we just want to make sure we put that in there as well. So that's the kind of damages bucket. The third thing is in response to some advocacy groups that were worried about mechanical restraints, and basically we clarified that mechanical restraints are always prohibited, and that physical restraints can be used under the sort of standard that's in the bill. I think this came from the disability rights community that basically said that under no scenario should there be mechanical restraints used regardless. And then finally, the final amendment is what Spencer referenced, which is that we exempt DHS, their transportation companies, but only from the bill's prohibition on the transport between the hours of between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. So in other words, I think the Senate inadvertently exempted DHS, from I do housing, so DHCD is always the first agency that's on my mind, but DHS was completely exempted from the bill, and instead this amendment clarifies that we're only trying to exempt them from the portion of the bill regarding the time, because we have learned that DHS does legitimate, non-traumatic, non-kidnapping forms of transportation, and sometimes they do those between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. And so we want them to give them the flexibility to do that. But the other provisions of the bills are such kind of no-brainers that they're not doing anyway, and so it doesn't really make sense to exempt them from those other provisions. Whew, okay, I said it was simple. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but those are the 4 amendments that are before you.
Okay, great. All right. Also in addition to the bill that came over amended. All right, great. Does the committee have any questions regarding the amendments that have been presented to us? Okay. All right. Well, okay, go ahead, Delegate Valentine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I did have a question. I'm looking through 3 or 4 different versions here. So I just wanted to clarify, the 10-year statute of limitations was a statute of limitations for what? If you would, Ms. or Delegate.
Sure, I could, Madam Chair. Great question. So it's a statute of limitations if the child wants to bring a lawsuit against the transportation company for damages that they suffered due to the transportation company's violation of this law.
And can I have a follow-up question, Madam Chair?
Yes, you may.
Delegate, how did you land on the number 10? I know a lot of times in a lot of statutes it's 3 or 5. I'm just curious as to where the logic was for that number.
Yes. So it basically just kind of a Goldilocks approach. I looked at a bunch of other statutes that are similar around sort of like child victims type statute limitations, right? Because when you think about it, if someone suffered this harm, let's say at age 15, the statute of limitations would start running upon their 18th birthday. But what the survivors have told us is that they did not even really begin to process their trauma until at the earliest their mid-20s, if not later, right? And so if it starts running at age 18 and we go with the more standard statute of limitations period of 3 years, we're saying they've got to file a lawsuit before they turn 22, which just realistically, very few people are going to be able to access that because they're still, in the pit of all the things that they had to go through as teenagers. So we chose 10 because honestly, there were some other laws I found that were 15 or 20 that seemed a little long. I have actually heard from a couple of members of your committee that think that it's too short and we should have done longer, but we did with 10 and we felt like that gives them until their 29th birthday basically to file a lawsuit, and we're hoping that enough survivors will sort of have the wherewithal to do that during that time period.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Delegate Sample Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I actually was getting ready to build on, or actually going to ask exactly what Delegate Valentine asked. So we're on the same page. But Delegate Stewart, let me just ask you this because I brought it up in the hearing and I don't recall if I was taking notes when you were talking. But you know how I had concern about any state funds going towards the parent being able to secure such transportation, not the one obviously through what we have with the state with DHS, but I'm talking about these private entities to utilize state funds to do that through any Medicaid or any types of insurances. So I was just curious if you were able to address that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Delegate, and I do remember you raising that issue. We actually really attempted to go down the rabbit hole of finding the answer to that question. I spoke with the library, I spoke to a couple of different agencies, and we also talked to the advocates about, where we could find this information. And unfortunately, we have not been able to run down the extent to which the state is involved in subsidizing these companies. Now, we do know that if we pass this bill, it applies to the companies, whether they're state funded or purely private funding. So to the extent that is a problem, the bill still goes a long way to solving it. But this is going to have to be an interim project for me that I pledge to you that I will hunt down and eventually get you an answer to this question.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Delegate.
All right, Delegate Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Delegate, for bringing this bill. I have I've taken notes on the House amendments, but I only have 3 here, and I think you mentioned 4, right?
Sure.
So I have the 10-year limitation for a child to bring suit. The parents can't waive the right of a child to bring suit later, and the allowance of DHS to transport during certain hours. What was that 4th one?
So yeah, so I said 4, but really there's the second one is like a bucket of 4. So it's really more like 7, but I'll just go through them again. So first, clarify that as long as the final destination is one of these camps, the bill applies. Second, adds compensatory damages instead of just restitution and reasonable attorney's fees. 3, clarifies that the bill is not retroactive, it's only prospective. 4, the statute of limitations of 10 years. 5, prohibiting these contracts from purporting to waive the child's right to sue. 6, clarifying that you can't use mechanical restraints at all. That's from the disability advocacy community. And then finally, 7, clarifying the exemption for DHS to be just about timing.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, I have a couple of questions for you, Delegate Stewart. The first one was, is there any kind of cap on the non-compensatory damages?
No, but I don't think that, unlike the child victims situation that you guys I know have been grappling with, these damages, because we're generally not talking about sex abuse acts or other things like that, they would not rise to the level that we're seeing under the Child Victims Act. They just would not be in that range of like the upper hundreds of thousands. The damage of basically being, blindfolded and thrown into a van is a real one. And I don't mean to discount that or diminish it or say that people are not owed legitimate damages, but the scale of which people are going to be able to sue and get payouts for this bill is not going to be similar at all to what you guys are grappling with the Child Victims Act and the budgetary consequences thereof.
Okay. Which brings me to another question, and talking about specifically the scale. Is there any data that indicates like how many times this happens in the state of Maryland, how many victims we're talking about? Does it happen mostly in the nighttime? Is there anything around that you might be aware of?
So it's really hard to know because these are all private companies and they're all private camps. And so the only way that you could really get data for this is if the camps were willing to tell you how many Maryland students they were taking in, or if somehow you had data from the transport company. So I went back, because I think this also came up at the hearing. I went back to the advocates about this, And they think that the number of Marylanders who are transported every year is probably in the hundreds. It's probably not in the tens, but it's definitely not in the thousands. But we don't have, a better idea than that, unfortunately, because this is all kind of shrouded in secrecy. Now, what we do know from the survivor stories, we have, this whole community of survivors in Maryland who went to these various camps. And they'll tell you that if their parents use one of these transportation companies, it's always in the night. It's always in the middle of the night. They pretty much always use some kind of either blindfold or handcuff or something like that. But it's always at night. It's always the whole point of this is you wake kids up in the middle of the night so that they're disoriented.
Understood. All right. And I know I have some folks on from DHS. Do you want to comment in any way regarding the knowledge that you may have on or data that you may have collected regarding any of the issues involved here? And I think Mr. Green, you may be one of the folks. Okay.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you.
Mhm.
In addition to the time frame in which the transports are occurring, the definition of child or a youth is a concern for us as well. When parents sometimes are making these agreements with these private agencies, they're not children that are in care, and so we don't have authority over children that are not within our care. In addition to that, it also excludes the term, the group home term, or better yet, the restraints that are needed for these kinds of individuals usually are overseen or within the disability population, and excuse my language if I'm mispronouncing that, which is overseen by the Department of Health. And so at any juncture, if our youth needs such the level of restraint, we have the ambulance, we have appropriate transportation companies that can do that, and we don't oversee their regulations. And so that's the only reason we're kind of wanting to not include ourselves within the boundaries of the amendments.
Got it. All right. Okay, the other question I have is that have there ever been, and maybe Delegate Stewart, you might even know this in your research, has there ever been an attempt to provide policy or provide any kind of guidelines or regulations to these specific transport organizations before this? Okay.
No, I mean, this is the second bill that has been introduced along these lines in the country. Oregon passed something very similar, and that was the first effort to really put any kind of safeguards or guardrails around this private transport. Now, there are some Maryland regs about kind of what state agencies can do when they're transporting people to like state facilities or to hospitals, and that those are important, obviously, but that's not really what we're getting at here. This is a pretty narrow bill because we're only talking about transporting people to camps, like residential camps that are generally almost always out of state. And so this is sort of a second in the nation attempt at trying to do that.
All right. And do we know how many, if any, exist here in the state that are the kind of the targeted transportation places?
We do know that if you go on the website of these youth transportation companies, they advertise themselves being statewide, or sorry, nationwide. That's the point, because they generally will sign contracts with the camps. And so that, you'll pay thousands of dollars, your kid will be scared straight or whatever at one of these camps. And then the camp will say, oh, and by the way, if your kid doesn't want to come, that's no problem. We'll hook you up with one of our youth transportation companies, and they'll gladly pick up your kid in the middle of the night and make sure they come. And they'll give them like either one or two companies to choose from. So I'm not sure if any of them, I couldn't find any youth transportation companies that are headquartered in Maryland. So I don't think that we're like impacting Maryland jobs to the extent that that's a concern. There are none that I could find that were registered or, got any sort of business license or anything like that in Maryland that I could find. But we know that all the major ones are operating in the state. And one thing I also note, just sort of out of respect for this industry, I forget the exact name, but this industry of transportation companies, not just youth transportation companies, just private transport companies generally, does have a professional association, and they reached out to us and said they support the bill. So I think the view of the overall kind of professional organization of private transport companies set is that like these are a handful of bad actors that specialize in taking these kids in the middle of the night to camps, and we don't want to associate with them. Like we don't want them in our group. Like we're not down with them. We find them like a legitimate offshoot of what we're trying to do as private transportation companies overall. So I thought that was interesting. That's news that I have since the hearing is that is the professional organization. I thought they may come in opposed or something, but they actually like it.
All right. All right, DHS, any other comments? Oh, I see Delegate Bartlett. You got a question, Delegate Bartlett?
I
Go ahead.
do. I have two questions.
Go ahead.
And I apologize for being late. I was on another meeting. The one question I had was the language that I thought was a little broad, vague, on page, I'm looking at I believe I'm on the reprint, and it's on page 3, on page 3, at the very bottom, any other secure facility. I was concerned about that because okay, no, I'm not. I'm not concerned about it anymore. I just read it again because what we're doing is we're saying it doesn't include these things or any other secured facility.
Yeah, that's the list of the exemptions, Madam Vice Chair.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
Okay, the any other secured facility, the broadness of it was a little bit confusing for me, but as long as I'm okay with that. So now the other question I had was on at the end with the parents. At the end, I guess it's on page 5. At the parents, at section C1, is there any penalty or accountability in the bill? I didn't see it, and I didn't know if I overlooked it or something.
Yeah, so there's not. So there's not any mechanism in the bill that the children could sue the parents or could otherwise take after the parents. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to something like that, or maybe that's an issue we could think about for next year. I do think that there's probably some pre-existing laws that this subcommittee would know better than me about causes of action that children can take for neglect and abuse and mistreatment by their parents. So it's possible that that would fall under the ambit of one of those existing laws. But it's something certainly worth thinking about, because by attempting to get some liability for these transportation companies, I'm not at all trying to let the parents off the hook. In some cases, they know exactly what they're purchasing and they know exactly what's going to happen to their child, and they're standing by and watching it happen as the child is basically dragged out of the home with a blindfold on it into a van. In some cases, maybe the parents didn't know and they thought this company was recommended to them and they didn't know the extent of it until it happened and they feel guilty about it. But I think at this stage it's probably tricky to try to think about adding that to this bill, but certainly would be happy to work with the committee in the interim to think about future steps we could take in that vein.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, any other questions from the committee? Okay. All right, any other comments from DHS since you're on the, okay. All right. Okay. All right, committee, so let's take a look at this. So just to sort this all out, you should have gotten another reprint, which is what Delegate Stewart just sent. And I know Delegate Stewart, you're gonna have to probably leave pretty soon, right?
We have voting at 1, Madam Chair, but I'm happy to stay with you guys as long as you need.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Because I think we may be done with most of the questions. All right, so the reprint, and which I'm trying to take a look at also. So again, we have SB 400, and that is the bill from Senator Giles, and that has her amendments on it. And let me make sure I'm clear about those amendments. And it came over, let me see, and you should have that as the first document that was sent to you. And in that, and I think what I may want to do, and Lauren, let me know if I'm okay in doing this. I think I wanted to do the 2 sets of amendments separately, because that's kind of how they came in. So we've got the amendments to 400, and I do believe, And that's the way it was voted out of the Senate, correct, Lauren?
Yes, and if I could just say what's confusing to me is
Yes.
that there are places where the amendments that Delegate Stewart is proposing are different and can be sort of independently decided. But there are places where the Senate made a decision that Delegate Stewart's amendments are different in sort of different ways. And so that's why my suggestion would be to have the agreed upon amendments drafted to the Senate bill. Because if you're tending, for example, the Senate bill has this definition of child, which
Yes.
excludes that, from, okay, that's one place, but all the different language about the mechanical restraints has slight differences, and it's very difficult to determine which version is the intended agreed upon version. So it
Right.
would be my preference to see all of those in the Senate bill in front of the committee, because it's so complicated to try to parse out those at this point.
Right. And the bill that you sent us, Delegate Stewart, did you attempt well, I know you took your bill, 497, but you also included Senator Giles' changes? in what
Yeah,
you sent
some
to
of
us?
them, yes, Madam Chair, some of them, yeah. But I'm happy. I totally hear Lauren. I'm happy to clean that up. I'm sorry for the confusion. We're happy to work with Senator Giles' office and clean that up so that you guys have something that's a little bit more intelligible.
Yeah, that's really what I think we need. And I may have not explained that very well to you or in my email, but that's what we were looking for, is a real overlay onto what her amendments were, so we could really understand it. Go ahead, Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just
Mhm.
wanted to reiterate, there really was no policy difference. It was a couple things. One was a drafting error, I think, on the intent on that DHS amendment on the timing. As Delegate Stewart said, it was broader than intended. So that just has to be cleaned up. And then there were several elements that I think were still in the works with some of the stakeholders that we weren't quite aware of. And prior to crossover, we were just trying to get it out the door. So certainly defer to the committee on whatever sequence makes most logistic sense, but ultimately the Senate bill should be conformed.
Okay, we lost Spencer. It sounded like he was attempting to say the Senate bill should be conformed, or the bill should be conformed, and that they were, he mentioned earlier that he took Delegate Stewart's amendments as friendly amendments. You went off, Spencer.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened there. I just immediately
okay.
it was closed. So apologize if that was me, but was just confirming that Senator Guile defers to Delegate Stewart in this committee and certainly welcomes any conforming that would take place after all the policy decisions are made.
Okay, got it. All right, Delegate Sample Hughes.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm comfortable with a lot of the amendments that the delegate has offered, and I just need a clarification on when DHS spoke, Mr. Green had referenced, that their agency does one thing, and then we have Department of Social Services, or I think that's who you said, or Department of Health, another one has another type of responsibility. I guess I just want to be clear on what we're going to move forward with, and how those two agencies interface. And so we're not doing anything that's like an unintended consequence to
Right.
harm the outlook on what those two agencies do for this population. So I just wanted to make sure that, does the Senate amendment speak to that, or do the House amendment speak to that concern, or do we just need to clean that part up that was referenced by DHS?
Right. So let me take a stab at that real quick. So I think the Department of Health, was it? I think, is that correct, Mr. Green?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. And along with the disabilities rights folks had concerns about the restraints. Is that what their concern was, and how they were done?
Yes, ma'am. That's my
Okay.
understanding.
Okay. And then in, I think, Senator Giles' bill, there was a lot of cleanup on that, how they physically are, et cetera. And I do believe also that Delegate Stewart might have done the same thing in his bill amendments as well. So it was more about the restraints, how they were done, how they shouldn't be you know, what that physically should look like. And then I think DHS, their concern was that they did not want to be included in the fact that you can, and maybe I'll let you go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Green. I'll let you go ahead.
When when Delegate mentioned the blindfolding and tossing a child into the, you know, that's never our intent when we're trying to keep a child safe. So, you know, we just wanted to make sure that was clear. And we also wanted to mention that the time constraints, we remove children at various times, days throughout the week. And so constraining us to that time frame should say the transport be needed would be detrimental to our operations for all 24 jurisdictions across the state. So more important, like I said, the biggest thing is the time constraint. We don't want to be held to a time in which we are able to utilize the service to ensure the safety of a child.
And I think as a result of that, you were excluded from that part of the bill, if I'm not mistaken. And is that correct, Delegate Stewart and Spencer?
That's right.
As well? Yeah.
Yeah, the amendments that you guys have exempt DHS from that requirement.
Right. So that was where those were the two issues, I think, Delegate Sample Hughes. And again, Delegate Stewart and Spencer, just make sure that that's correct.
Yes, Madam
Okay,
Chair.
so I guess the only thing is, as written right now, with our whole conceptual thought process of this,
Yes.
we're okay. Is that correct for the agency, Department, DHS? Are we just making sure we're not doing anything that doesn't speak to what you do?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, ma'am. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So we can, as we've done in the past, we can take a vote on the amendments, and we can do them conceptually. Now, okay, so procedurally, Lauren, do we have to also vote on Senator Giles' amendments? Or because they've already come over with the bill?
I thought that only in what is in front of the committee is just the Senate bill.
Yes, that is correct.
So, I mean, before the subcommittee, rather. I
Yes.
don't know that this House bill has been sent to the subcommittee.
That
So
is
that's
correct.
why I was suggesting it would be, I mean, you could maybe, if everybody, you could, I guess, conceptually vote on what Delegate Stewart said, but it would be great if he could get that set in front of everybody to double check it
Yeah.
before the committee maybe takes a final vote, because like I said, I still think it's a little confusing because it says, you know, the definition of child taking in the Senate version is different, and these mechanical and physical, the language is slightly different, and it would be good that
Right.
that is correct the way that everybody's agreed, rather than, if that makes sense.
No,
So-
it does. It does, Lauren. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you're right, Lauren. Let's just go ahead and do that. So if we can get the version, as I mentioned, to just as a again to go ahead and again, we're working from SB 400, okay, and just do an overlay of your amendments, Delegate Stewart. I think that's going to be helpful because it is very confusing right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect. I'm happy to do that, Madam Chair. And
Okay.
I don't know the next time you guys are voting as a full committee, but whatever your will is, either to have another subcommittee meeting about this, or if you wanted to vote it out conceptually, I could definitely have that to you before you guys take your next full committee vote.
Well, what we'll probably do is do this. We'll probably just come back to a subcommittee meeting, a very quick one, to discuss this. But again, we need your overlay in order to do that. I think that's probably going to be the best thing, just so everybody can have an opportunity to actually read it, review it, and understand it. Okay? Okay, great. All right. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the subcommittee. And we, again, our mission is to get another version of the all the amendments, one place. We can review them on SB 400. So again, we'd appreciate that, Delegate Stewart. Thank you so much. And thank you to the subcommittee. And do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'm not even going to wait for the second. I'm going to make the second. All right. See you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Bye.